Great. Well, thanks so much, everyone, for joining. First of all, I just wanted to give a little bit of an introduction, talk through the agenda here. We're planning to first have myself and each of the three speakers give a little introduction with some slides, talking through kind of our background and perspectives on this issue. Then we'll have a pretty lengthy Q&A session. So if you can, I think it should be a really interesting session. You can feel free to either type up your questions into the chat box, and then we can read those out after and have the speakers answer the questions. Or you can hold on to your questions and raise your hand during the session, and we can call on you, and you can unmute yourself and turn your video on to directly ask the questions. So, telecommuting, Boon or Bane? I think this is a very timely session trying to figure out what are the unintended consequences of telecommuting, especially now that this pandemic has forced upon us such an abrupt change in work style. Let's see. Brooke, could you go to the next slide? Perfect. So we just wanted to give a little plug first for this new Telework policy guide. As part of the Mid-Ohio Regional Planning Commission's mission to reduce travel demand, they created the Central Ohio Employer Telework Policy Guide to support their local government members. This guide was developed to support the long-term transition to telework. Exploring full-time, part-time, and flexible telework scenarios, the guide is intended to help employers understand the benefits and challenges of various schedules of telework and define what makes sense for their organizations. If you're interested in learning more, Brooke will put the web address on the chat to access this guide, and you can contact any MORPC staff member for more information as well. Just a little bit of personal background about myself. I am a managing consultant at the sustainability consulting firm called Ramble, and there will be a little bit more on that in the upcoming slides. My own personal background is I grew up in Wyoming, so up in the mountains where the buffalo roam, and I currently live in Pittsburgh, so not so far from Ohio. I got my bachelor's master's from MIT, and after college, I started at Ramble doing air quality and climate change consulting. So I've done a lot of work in California, and where California has very ambitious and very aggressive long-term climate goals. And we've worked with a lot of different land use developers, legal clients, and industrial source owners to develop innovative GHG mitigation strategies and quantification. A lot of my professional focus has been working on net zero carbon development. So trying to figure out what are the different ways to reduce building energy consumption and also mobile emissions. So through electric vehicles, zero net energy, smart mobility options on how to basically reduce your emissions long term. And I think it's really exciting to talk about teleworking because that is a way to just immediately, you'd think, reduce vehicle miles traveled. So I'm interested to hear the speakers' perspectives on that. Ramble as a whole is a fairly large consulting firm. It's got about 16,000 experts worldwide and is headquartered in Denmark. We have about 2,000 consultants in the US, and we're mostly focused on environment and health within the US. We also have services across a lot of different markets. One kind of interesting thing about Ramble is that it's owned by a foundation, so it is not subject to short-term market whims or short-term investors, and can really try to take a long-term view on sustainability. So I think that's been very much a part of the company's background. Can go on to the next one. And just to touch on two of our main service areas that I'm a part of, one is air quality. We work with a lot of land use developers, but also a lot of industry on modeling the impacts of air quality emissions from any types of sources, including area sources, transportation, as well as buildings and industry, and try to look at what is the health risk impact, what is the effect on ambient air quality, and how can you minimize those impacts. And then sustainability is the other kind of realm that, these are all very tied together, but we're working on it's about advising clients on how to achieve the UN Sustainable Development Goals, incorporate climate change, circular economy, really try to just minimize our impacts. A lot of this is on the environment itself, but we are also interested in trying to work more on equity, social and governance goals in addition to just environmental aspects. And my contact information is here. I think at the final slide, there will also be contact for myself and all of the speakers. So you can feel free to get in touch if you have any questions. So our first speaker here is going to be Jerry Tinyanow. He is the proprietor of Western Urban Sustainability Advisors, LLC. WestUrb assists local governments in creating and improving sustainability programs. It also works with vendors that sell products or services to such programs and interest groups that want to improve local sustainability policies. Jerry's work at WestUrb reflects the successes he achieved as Denver's first Chief Sustainability Officer from 2012 through 2019. Under his leadership, Denver became the 5th U.S. city certified at the platinum level of the U.S. Green Building Council's Lead for Cities program. During his tenure, Denver was also included in the A list of top performing cities in climate change reporting and action by the International Climate Change Organization, CDP. Jerry received his undergraduate and law degrees from George Washington University. He was the 2018 winner of the Worth Chair Sustainability Award given by the University of Colorado. We look forward to Jerry presenting a few slides here on his background and perspective on this issue.
Thank you very much, Shayna, and hello, everybody. I first want to pay tribute to Ramble for sponsoring this session. I've worked with Ramble's office in Denver, also worked with their offices in Finland and Germany, and they are a fabulous company, and it's a real honor to have them being a sponsor today, so thank you, Shayna. So, hello, everybody, and good afternoon from beautiful Denver, Colorado. It's been 8 years since I left Morpsey to become Denver's first Chief Sustainability Officer. And last year I left city government to open my own consultancy. I now advise other local governments on how to build better sustainability programs based on my experiences during the 7 years I was working for the city of Denver and getting it to platinum. Next slide, please. Last April, I put this article in my LinkedIn profile, and I argued that working from home should become the top sustainable mobility strategy for cities, not a strategy, but the strategy. Now, I don't say working from home anymore. That turned out to be too narrow. I now use the term telecommuting, which is the subject of today's session. Next slide, please. There are many definitions. This is my definition. It's similar to the one that Morpsey put in its new telecommuting policy guide, which, by the way, I just reviewed yesterday, and it's a fabulous document. For those of you who don't follow telecommuting around the country, Morpsey is a real leader with this document right now, and I've actually already recommended to Morpsey that they apply for a Trailblazer Award from the National Association of Development Organizations. But in any event, my definition, Morpsey's definition are similar. The definition includes working from home, but it also includes working in other nearby settings, for example, coffee shops. And let me tell you, after I left city government and started working on my own, I discovered that coffee shops are the modern American workplace for many these days. Telecommuting isn't new. A small number of people have already been doing it, but suddenly over half of the workforce is doing it. That's why we're paying attention. Next slide, please. Telecommuting intrigued me. We need to keep reducing greenhouse gas emissions even with the pandemic, but the pandemic has undermined a lot of our traditional strategies like transit. Telecommuting seems to be a way to keep reducing community greenhouse gas emissions even in the pandemic. In most cities, transportation already accounts for 25% of such emissions, and it's the fastest growing source of greenhouse gas emissions. Commuting by driving alone, also known as SOV commuting, single occupant vehicle, represents a huge chunk of those emissions. Now I'm showing you here the latest commuting statistics for Denver County and Franklin County from the Census Bureau's American Community Survey. In Denver, 68.5% of commuters were driving to work in 2018, by themselves, and 8.7% were working from home, a term that the Census Bureau still uses. Franklin County had more SOV commuters, 80.3%, and fewer people working from home. Now, I don't know if Franklin County has a commuting goal, but Denver has a goal to get SOV commuting down to 50% by 2030. And keep in mind with that, over half of commuters would still be driving to work in cars. It's not that no one would be driving, it's just we'd have a big reduction in that and a reduction in greenhouse gas emissions as well. So I took these numbers and I played with them to see how many people would need to switch from driving alone to telecommuting to get to that 50% level. Next slide, please. And here you see it. In Denver, about a quarter of SOV commuters would have to switch. In Franklin County, it's more like a third. But keep in mind that with this switch, we wouldn't have to increase anything else in the middle. We wouldn't have to have more carpooling, more transit, more biking, or more walking. And that's important because all of these other tools were already struggling even before the pandemic, and the pandemic made things worse. Some of them, like carpooling and transit, take place in enclosed vehicles that people don't want to share with other people. And in addition, the recession has put a huge hit on public funding for transit and infrastructure for cycling and walking. Next slide, please. But in thinking about telecommuting, we have to understand that there are problems. Not everyone likes it. For some, it's an opportunity, but for others, it's a burden. And if policy members are going to address it, they need to keep that in mind. Next slide, please. Telecommuting is expanding with or without local government action. So local governments can be passive, but they can also be active. And they can support it or they can oppose it. But regardless of what they decide to do, they will need to consider these issues. There are winners and losers. It's not that everyone wins. Community energy use might go up or it might go down. The same with greenhouse gas emissions. And government has to decide what it can do and of those things, what it will do. Our next two speakers are going to address some of these issues, and they really do need to be addressed up front before undertaking policy decisions. Next slide, please. These are the 5 tools available to local government for anything they want to do, including telecommuting. The mandate, thou shalt. The prohibition, thou shalt not. The bargain, if you do this, we'll do that. The tax, if you do this, you're going to pay for it. And the bully pulpit, we think you should do this. So as we talk about policy options, please keep in mind, they have to be one of these 5 things. These are the only tools that are available to local government. Next slide, please. So we have a lot to talk about this afternoon, and the next 2 speakers are going to highlight some of the issues with telecommuting, and then we'll have time for your questions. If for some reason we don't get to all of your questions, here's my contact information. Feel free to contact me after this session is over. Thank you very much, and Shayna, I'll give it back to you.
Great, thank you, Jerry. Very interesting. Next, I'd like to introduce Dr. Courtney McClooney. She's an assistant professor of organizational behavior in the School of Industrial and Labor Relations at Cornell University. Dr. McClooney's research examines how practices in organizational contexts create marginalized groups, experiences, and structures. She completed a postdoctoral fellowship in the Darden School of Business at the University of Virginia and earned her PhD in psychology at the University of Michigan and earned her BA in psychology and interpersonal organizational communications at the University of North Carolina at Chapel Hill, where she was a Ronald E. McNair Scholar. Dr. McClooney has published numerous articles and book chapters in academic and practitioner outlets. Prior to her academic career, she completed a research fellowship at Catalyst Incorporated and an AmeriCorps Social Impact Fellowship in Boston, Massachusetts. Dr. McClooney is a first-generation college graduate from High Point, North Carolina. So we expect Dr. McClooney to give a really interesting, different perspective than Jerry, and look forward to seeing what she has to say.
Thank you so much, Shayna, and thank you all so much for having me. I'm certainly coming at this from a different, more organizational management lens. And in it, I'm drawing on my expertise in diversity, equity, and inclusion in the workplace. So as Jerry mentioned, the telecommuting policy will have differential impacts on different groups of people at work. And as local governments go forth with their policy creations and trying to make telecommuting work best for all, they'd want to keep some of these things in mind, some of the early findings that we have from these COVID studies that could show different gender, racial, and socioeconomic gaps and who is actually benefiting from telecommuting and what needs to happen in order for there to be inclusion across the board. Next slide, please. So I first want to start with some definitions of how organizational behavior scholars have approached the study of telecommuting and flexible work arrangements. So it's broadly defined, as Jerry said, as performing work tasks from home, and it has since branched out to co-working spaces or coffee shops, more public spaces. But given our COVID-19 pandemic, it's majority working from home, and even more so working in isolation. Telecommuting represents one of many flexible work arrangement policies, and ironically, flexible work policies were advocated strongly for people from marginalized social identity groups. These include women, working parents, racial ethnic minorities, people with different abilities, and et cetera. A lot of people prefer these flexible work arrangements, including having half-time or being able to work from home on a regular basis. And lots of studies have shown that given this flexibility increases workers' sense of autonomy, and they enhances their fit between work and family life, and they have more control over their workday, for instance. And this is associated with increased productivity and happiness. So as of June 2020, Gartner found that approximately 1/2 of these companies that they surveyed, 80% of their employees are working from home in the early stages of this pandemic. And it's estimated that this will be a long-term work from home situation. Most companies, especially in the tech field, have announced that they are not returning to work until July 2021. So this massive, abrupt, and mandatory for many employees switch to work from home has required employees to adapt and become more open to adopting this practice post-pandemic. Yet as large numbers of workers are forced to work from home, many face challenges due to such fundamental issues as not having space in one's home to attend to work. So some of the challenges that have been already identified with telecommuting relate to family structures and also people's social identity groups. So there's lots of research from Harvard researcher Lakshmi Ramarajan that shows that people actually have difficulty maintaining boundaries between their work selves and their non-work selves. There's often work to family spillover, such as stress and from long work days, for instance. And the forced confinement of workers during this COVID-19 pandemic has further complicated this issue. So although work from home might sound appealing because it's safe in terms of not spreading this virus, the absence of separation between one's work and home and the lack of commutes to provide a transition between work and home can become a burden too. Parents in particular have been the most vocal type of workers who have talked about the difficulties of telecommuting. And we've particularly found differences in the share of childcare responsibilities being disproportionately labeled onto women. So in one study, they found that for working parents with children the age 1 through 5, found that women's reduction in work hours since April was 4.5 times larger than the fathers in the home. So this was in heterosexual households. And this indicates that even when both parents are able to work from home, and many may be more directly exposed to childcare and housework demands, mothers are the one who are scaling back to meet these responsibilities. And this is continuing to widen the already present gender gap in our leadership, but also in who's being given challenging assignments and being eligible for promotions at work. So although telecommuting may shrink the gender gap in childcare because your child is physically present, and if fathers or in heterosexual couples were not as present in their children's home life, they may now be forced to be, we're still seeing that women are the ones who are reporting fewer hours due to having their children in the home. I also co-authored several pieces this summer about working from home and the growing racial injustice that's happening in this country and popping up around the world. And one of the things that my co-author, Laura Morgan Roberts, and I found out in our study of code switching at work was that working from home as a person of color, and in particular as a Black person, could also pose unique challenges. So in my research, I study racial code switching, which for those of you who do not know is the adjustment of one's speech, appearance, behavior, and mannerisms in order to optimize the comfort of others, usually someone who's in a more powerful position. And in professional work environments, the group that's more likely to work from home, Black employees are often tokens that they're underrepresented in these workspaces. And everything about their cultural identity is seen as atypical for professional work environments. This includes wearing your hair in natural styles, sometimes a style of speak, and even the way that you dress or physical artifacts present in your home. So during this pandemic, Black professionals are not only being recognized as isolated individuals at work in general, but they're offering a window into their home life, which could signal certain things such as their social class background, but also certain elements of their cultural identity that they're not comfortable bringing into the workplace. So this video conferencing has transformed this formerly safe private space separate from the workplace into a public gaze. And this might increase the sense of stress and feeling to code switch for Black employees, which could ultimately lead to greater levels of stress. And although, as I said, Black employees tend to be underrepresented in professional work environments, they are overrepresented in the type of occupations that aren't allowed to work from home, as are Latinx and other low-income individuals, which means that they also have greater exposure to the coronavirus. Next slide, please. So one of the things that local governments need to keep an eye on is how this pandemic is demonstrating these trends and how our future workplaces might look. So telecommuting, if not looked at through an equitable lens, could widen disparities that are already in existence. So as I mentioned before, mostly Black and Latinx individuals are working in occupations that are not only exposing them to coronavirus, but in the future could become automated. McKinsey did a fantastic report showing the percentage of people across certain racial groups that are represented in occupations that are already slated for robotic transformation. And although that will lead to productivity for certain jobs and in addition to cutting back on pay, and it could likely be a safer option if we continue to live within this pandemic for a long time, it is going to disproportionately affect the employment opportunities for people from certain backgrounds. The other trend that we're seeing is that people from lower socioeconomic backgrounds, particularly those who are also people of color, are also having disparities in educational outcomes. Due to the closure of public schools and of childcare facilities, there is this growing movement of learning pods, which are individually funded private learning opportunities that will ensure that some children have continued non-interrupted education and that others will be left behind. One quote from this article in CNN has this great illustration of the learning pods. It's based off what I've seen online. The learning pod movement appears to be led by families with means, a large portion of whom are white. Paradoxically, at a time when the Black Lives Matter movement has prompted a national reckoning of white supremacy, white parents are again ignoring racial and class inequality when it comes to educating their children. As a result, they are actively replicating the systems that many of them are saying they want to dismantle. The learning pods also demonstrates another inequitable gap, which is the digital gap. Access to high-speed broadband internet is less likely in rural and low-income places. So as companies hope for this telecommuting policy to help in terms of mitigating the spread of the virus, it can also bring forth these other issues. And as I said earlier, when it came to working parents, there is research showing that women's progress has also stalled greatly in the workplace. And it has, at this point, pushed women back for several decades of the progress they have made at work. In addition to women in professional roles, women's jobs were 1.8 times more likely to be vulnerable to the crisis than men's jobs because they were overrepresented in the type of service industries that were forced to close during this pandemic. And women make up 39% of global employment, but account for 54% of overall job losses as of May 2020. So at the same time, the burden of unpaid care work, including childcare, but also elder care responsibilities and work in nursing homes, falls disproportionately onto women, which further increases their exposure to this virus. Next slide, please. So here I offer just a couple of things that local governments want to keep in mind, given everything I just shared about some of the rising and widening disparities that this pandemic and telecommuting can bring forward. One is to keep in mind that there are multiple interlocking systems that are creating disparities that affect all workers. So being mindful of people's gender background, their family structure, the amount of money that they have and wealth opportunities. And so as you're developing policies, you want to consider what fair and equitable strategies will ensure the full participation of all workers, especially as we transition into a new world of work that is likely to have more telecommuting options. And finally, it's important that companies and the local government start to forecast how working from home will affect current economic, racial, and gender trends that we're seeing in society already. And I offer a list of resources, some of these references that I talked about in my presentation here. So I highly recommend that you follow up with these articles that are present. And of course, you can reach out to me following today's presentation if you have any other specific questions about racial, gender, and socioeconomic inequalities that are coming forward and might continue with telecommuting. Thank you.
Thank you, Courtney. Very interesting background. And I think these are, all very relevant issues and kind of demonstrate how the pandemic interplays with all of these other current events. So next up, we're gonna switch gears, introduce Dr. Liam O'Brien. He is an associate professor in civil and environmental engineering at Carleton University in Ottawa, Canada. He is the principal investigator of the Human Building Interaction Lab, which consists of a team of 15 researchers with diverse backgrounds in engineering, architecture, and psychology. His team is developing occupant-centric design processes, building code, and controls for high-performance buildings. He's authored over 150 publications and 2 books on this topic. So we look forward to getting more into the nitty-gritty of building energy and technical impacts of telecommuting.
Awesome. Thanks so much for having me, and it's a pleasure to join you from north of the border. So I'm going to try to answer, or at least give some insights to this question: does teleworking save energy? And I'm using teleworking fairly broadly, sort of synonymously with telecommuting. And I noticed the others use telecommuting. I'm just using teleworking, but I mean the same thing. Next slide, please. Maybe you can just advance and we can show the entire slide. Okay, so this topic's actually been looked at for the past 50 years or so. So it's not new, but I think the researchers back 50 years ago would be pretty excited to see that we sort of have a quasi-natural experiment where where something that used to be a sort of a trickle, couple percent per year increase in telework is now mainstream, for better or worse. So the way I like to see teleworking and the energy impacts is to look at this diagram at the bottom, which shows that we're often talking about transportation energy savings or emission savings and office energy, but there's a lot of rebound effects. And so the maximum potential considers transportation and office savings, but actually there's a lot of things working against that. So one is the fact that now we're using more energy at home. And I'll get into each of these in a moment. There's also energy use in vacant offices. It's not like we work at home and suddenly our office building doesn't use energy, quite the contrary. There's added transportation because now we're doing things like doing separate errands instead of picking up kids on the way home from work or doing groceries on the way home from work. And there's also more reliance on information and communication technology. So I did a literature review recently before COVID started, so kind of pure coincidence. And I looked at what of the studies said on this topic about whether telecommuting actually saves energy. And the results are pretty surprising. So next slide, please. So I'm going to look at each of those 4 domains and feel free to just click through all the points. Thanks, Brooke. So first thing we'll look at is transportation, because this is arguably the biggest impact. And generally beneficial, but 3 of the 21 studies that have looked at this in detail said actually transportation use went up. And that might be pretty surprising to everyone, including myself. Some of the reasons: there's poor trip chaining, as in what I mentioned before, kind of integrating multiple tasks into a single trip. If you're working from home, then the rest of your family has access to the car. You might buy a bigger car because you think, just psychologically, well, I'm not going to drive as much, so I can justify a bigger car because I won't burn as much gas. But that's not necessarily the case. We're seeing, very frighteningly, people are moving outwards from cities, especially big cities like New York City. You pay a huge premium to live close to your work, to the point where it's practically crippling, right? You're spending the majority of your income on rent. And if you don't have to do that, you move outwards. But the suburbs or the exurbs are associated with bigger distances and more reliance on cars. Another factor is if there's less traffic, you're more likely to drive, ironically. One of the things that's clear from the literature is we don't know whether teleworkers move further because they can, or whether suburbanites telework more. So the jury's out on that, but I think it's probably a combination of both. Next slide, please. So another thing people assume is that office buildings save a lot of energy, but that's not really the case, especially in North America. Our buildings are highly automated. We have centralized HVAC systems, lighting that's very coarsely controlled. And so the result is that even if a building is half empty or half full, we're still lighting the space, most of it, ventilating, heating, cooling. So there's still a lot of energy use. And I don't want to go into detail on these graphs on the right, but what they show is 4 different academic buildings. I think it's somewhere on the East Coast in the US. And they looked at the relationship of energy use. 0, meaning that if the building is empty, no energy use. What we're seeing is that that's not the case. And there's still a lot of energy use, even if the building is empty. Next slide, please. And so I think as many of us are starting to recognize, if we pay our energy bills, energy use is going up in homes. And one of the issues I'll touch on is that our homes are not really designed very well to just make our office comfortable. Our homes usually, at least in North America, have centralized systems like this furnace, which means if we want to keep our office warm or cold, we have to heat the entire house. The other thing we're hearing about a lot in the news is that people want bigger homes. And so now we're having to heat and cool a bigger home, more land use, more development, more materials, and so on. So there's a lot of rebound effects at home. Next slide, please. And finally, on the ICT side, basically internet use, this is not insubstantial. So internet use is somewhere around 5 to 10% of total electricity use globally. But I'll point out, compared to the other factors, I think it's relatively small. I give the example that if you watch Netflix for about 4 days, that's equivalent to driving 15 kilometers or maybe 9 miles. So not that substantial overall. But as Courtney mentioned, the rural internet issue is a big problem. I even faced that where I live in Ottawa, or I have a place outside of Ottawa, and I basically can't meet out there. So I can only imagine what it's like to live in such an area. Next slide, please. So I tried to look at the studies that took a fairly quantitative approach and did a direct comparison, and I've plotted those here, and I won't go into the details other than to say the most interesting thing I found is that over time, so these are ranked from kind of most energy savings to least on the graph, but it turns out that seems to coincide roughly with the date. So in more recent studies, they found that the energy savings from teleworking is worse and worse, to the point where one recent study found it actually increases energy use. Next slide, please. So I just wanted to conclude by saying that teleworking is touted as saving energy and being more sustainable. I think we need to be really careful because the image on the left is much less sustainable than the one on the right, even though there's the green. There's a lot of inherently good things about sustainability in fairly dense, walkable cities. So thank you very much for listening.
Thank you, Liam. That's very interesting, very surprising results, actually. So I think next, let's see, Brooke, would you mind putting up the contact information for the speakers? So next, we have about 25 minutes for Q&A. If you can either add to the chat or raise your hand, we'll call on you. I think I'll just kick this off with a question that can go to all of the panelists. COVID-19 has upended our traditional work atmospheres. To kick things off, can each of you describe whether and how telecommuting fits into your lives, both now and before the pandemic? So just to kind of learn a little bit more how it affects you. Jerry, do you want to respond first?
Well, before the pandemic, but after I left the city, I was already working from home. And so in that respect, it didn't really change much for me. But I did, before the pandemic, I was spending a lot of time in those coffee shops or other remote workplaces where other people were working. And those are kind of off limits right now. We can do a little bit outside, but I have noticed that change. I consider that to be temporary. And then Liam mentioned the question of rural areas. So my wife and I also own a second home in Crested Butte, which we rent out, but we also go there sometimes ourselves. And that's a county with only 16,000 people in it. However, we've outfitted with high-speed internet, and it works very well. So I have not had trouble in an area like that in Gunnison County working remotely. For us, it's the same whether we're in Denver or up in the mountains.
Interesting. Yeah, I think that also speaks to just how different people's access is to these digital tools. So, all right, Courtney, would you like to answer that?
Yes. So prior to the pandemic, I was actually living in Virginia, and then my job started. I had to physically move during a pandemic to a very rural place. So although Cornell University is a world-class research institution, it is located in Ithaca, New York. And the university has invested in digital infrastructure, but not everyone's homes. So as a new professor, I've actually had worse internet than I've ever had as a grad student or as a postdoc, because all of the infrastructure is on campus, which we are discouraged from going to. And prior to that, part of the professor and academic life, you do spend a lot of time on your own and sort of in isolation to get work done and to not be distracted by things. So it's been exacerbated. And I saw someone put in the chat talking about the mental health of folks working from home. One of the other pandemics as part of this is loneliness and isolation that lots of mostly young professionals, especially as they move to cities to start jobs and to advance their careers, if they aren't partnered, there have been an increase in sales in cats and dogs and people wanting some sort of companionship as they are forced to or encouraged to distance. But yes, it has been really interesting change. I would say my day-to-day didn't change too much because I was working from isolation a lot to write and do research, but having to teach like this is a huge difference than being in person, and meeting new colleagues for the first time virtually instead of in person has been a challenge.
Yeah, absolutely. My husband's a professor as well. I just found that same issue, just trying to meet with new students in particular, people who moved here from other countries and haven't yet met anyone. It's very challenging mentally. All right, Liam, how about your impact of this on your life?
Yeah, for sure. I found motivation is way down. I have been a fairly prolific young researcher. Maybe when I got tenure, it slowed down a little bit. But I am just trying to maintain right now, even though I don't have circumstances that prevent a lot of productivity. This morning, I slept in until 5 minutes before my first meeting. And it was kind of wonderful, but it's also telling that I'm not jumping out of bed to get to work.
Yeah, very interesting. All right. Are there any questions from the audience of people who want to unmute themselves and speak? If not, we have a couple of questions in the chat that I can read out. Okay, we'll go to the chat. So Courtney, you sort of touched on this, but are there any studies looking at the mental health of folks that work from home? It might be hard to separate it now from general depression with COVID-19 and other societal ills.
Yes, I definitely think it's hard to separate now. The one researcher who comes to mind is Sigal Barside at University of Pennsylvania's Wharton School of Business. She studies emotions in the workplace and had started some work on loneliness even before the pandemic, as people can feel isolated at work psychologically, even if they're not physically isolated. So that has certainly been increasing alongside this pandemic. But the other bright side is that lots of therapists have gone online as well. And people are having more access to therapists than they've ever had before due to, whatever physical limitations might have been. A barrier is no longer a barrier as long as they have access to high-speed internet. So that has been one bright side of this. I love being able to meet my therapist from home and have like my comfort objects right next to me, which is great.
Yeah, that's true. That's a good resource as long as people know that those resources exist. So I guess that's a whole other issue. Yeah, I've been working from home for about 3 years now, and so I feel like the before and after, it is different just working from home during a pandemic versus where you're kind of anxious all the time looking at the news versus working from home the rest of the time when life is normal. Another question from the audience from Lexi Petrella for Jerry and Courtney. As we go into winter, it'll be interesting to see if businesses return to telework after going back to work in person if the COVID spikes come back up. How do local governments thoughtfully engage with telework disparities with recommended policies quickly so that vulnerable populations are not left behind in rapid response? So I think, the question is, if COVID spikes, some companies are going to immediately pull back, but you might be making some people more vulnerable if they are, less proactive or have less of a financial cushion. I think that's the question.
Let me start out with that because I touch on that in the article that I put in my LinkedIn profile back in April. I think local government often tends to, the term that's often used is lead by example. So first they set things up in their own workplace and then demonstrate that actively, not passively, not just assuming that they do it and then someone else will imitate it, but doing it actively for the rest of the community. And one of the things that I recommend in there, which addresses one of the points that Courtney made, is that you don't ask people to work remotely unless you, the employer, give them the tools to do that. And that's not just free wireless internet service. It's the computer, the camera, the printer, the free wireless, of course, the office furniture, the telephone, and so forth, and the training that they need to do things like what I'm doing here. Courtney mentioned some people aren't really eager to share what their home looks like, and I know I'm not. I'm not actually, sitting with a view of the Denver skyline in my background. I'm using a background. And so for that issue, one of the things employers can do is teach employees how to do something like this so they don't have to show off, what's in their home. And you can even do that then, out in the community if the government wants to take this step, which again, I recommended in the article, is you can offer incentives. In my list of 5 things, that's a bargain. If you, the employer, do this, we, the city, will do this. You can give them an incentive on sales tax or income tax relief if they set up a telecommuting program that offers those same things that the city is offering. We're in the West here. We don't like mandates real well, but we do like incentives. And so while we can't order people to run their telecommuting policies that way, we can incentivize them and say, you should have some people working at home or working remotely if you need to, but you really need to provide them with the tools and training to do that, including some of these other issues that Courtney mentioned, which is help with kids at home and help with meals. My guess is it's probably, even with all that help, it's going to be cheaper than bringing them in to work at the office.
I agree with Jerry, and I'll just add one more point. Prior to the pandemic, we were actually exploring the 4-day work week. That was a proposal on the table, and several scholars are starting to talk about what that might mean for productivity, what that would mean for health. And then the pandemic hit, and we were forced to figure out things quickly. But I do hope we go back to that conversation, because I think shortening the work week overall would help address a lot of these issues that are going on, especially as schools figure out their schedules. How often do they want to open in person? And how long will the school year be now that we're in this situation? I hope that we can revisit shortening our time outside of home working, and that will address lots of issues that come with parenting and trying to work in general.
Yeah, thanks, Courtney. Well, kind of building on that, so Jerry, you sort of touched on some specific policies and practices already, but I was wondering, white-collar office positions are more easily done remotely and with flexible hours than typical service work. And economically privileged populations are also more likely to be able to afford quiet and adequately heated and cooled workspaces, childcare, and telecommunications tools. So these facts seem to naturally widen the existing gaps in the American workforce, both from an equity and an energy standpoint. Can you suggest any specific policies or practices that would help reduce these unintended consequences, both in terms of energy consumption and in equity, that could be implemented at either the local city level or at a company level? What are things that we should be suggesting to our policymakers and to our companies? I think all of you probably have some perspective on this.
If you'd like me to start out, I've mentioned some of them already. And it's important when dealing with telecommuting as a policy to keep in mind, and this is true of a lot of different areas in sustainability, is we don't have to have everyone doing something. We don't have to have everyone telecommuting or everyone using electric vehicles, or everyone taking transit or whatever. I know we set goals that sound like this, you know, we have 100% renewable energy, or, you know, zero carbon or whatever, but realistically, we don't get to 100% or zero, and we don't have to. And so in my statistics, I showed you that I have a situation where 50% of people are still driving somewhere to work, and they're still driving themselves to work. And even with that level, we still have a huge savings in greenhouse gas emissions, and I believe also energy. One of the things you can do is, remember, telecommuting doesn't have to be all or nothing. It doesn't have to be, you're either here 5 days a week or you're at home 5 days a week. You can have job sharing. You can have 2, 2, and 1. That's what some places are doing. You know, one worker is there for 2 days, another worker in the same seat for 2 days, and then everyone's working remotely for the 5th day. So one suggestion I make both to public and private employers is, don't think about this as all or nothing. Take that 50%, you know, that we're trying to get down to, and shuffle workers around, and also do the things I said earlier, which is, if you're working at home, if you expect someone to work at home, they have to be fully supported. Otherwise, it's just a kind of a cop-out policy.
Liam.
Courtney, have any other thoughts on that?
Sure. I just wanted Liam to have a chance to talk to. So I agree with Jerry that the job sharing in particular is considered like a feminist approach to work as well. It's all about collective organizing and making sure that we address the needs of humanity, right? That people get sick, and we, you know, rarely have sick leave policies that are health focused, sick leave policies that are prognosis focused. Not until you get the prognosis that death is imminent do workers or employers tend to care and adjust their insurance accordingly. So having a more health-centric, humanity-focused, human sustainability model of work, I think, is certainly where we can start thinking about how to derive policies from there. And the job sharing piece, I think, is something that is coming up in the Carework conversation. So as I mentioned earlier, a lot of the jobs that have been impacted, both in terms of exposure to the coronavirus, but also in terms of job loss, have really been impacting women, and getting more specific, women of color, low-income women, women who are in care work responsibilities. So nursing homes were hit particularly hard, nurses in hospitals. I think the latest statistic I saw was that mostly Filipino nurses, although they are severely underrepresented in terms of the workforce, are disproportionately dying from COVID. So there have been more calls in those sectors in particular to have more of these job sharing models, so that the same person isn't exposed and then bringing it home to children or to elder parents, et cetera. So really figuring out ways to build a more sustainable, from a human-centric strategy, I think would be a viable option.
Could I direct a question to Liam on this? Because I think there's an aspect of this that he may be able to answer. You know, Liam, when you looked at, and you were correct in your analysis, that offices empty out because of telecommuting, but they still require energy. Did anyone look at the possibility, though, that as this becomes a more permanent part of our economy, that some of the space that empties out actually can be converted to residential or to something else? I mean, right now, I don't know about other cities, but in Denver, downtown housing is exclusionary. It's very, very expensive. And it's expensive because everyone wants to live downtown because they have access to all these great amenities. The downtown landlords are worried that with telecommuting, they're going to start losing office space rentals and so forth. But I'm wondering whether some of that space can be taken over by residential units. Might have to make some changes in zoning and so forth. I don't know if any of the studies you look at actually consider that or look that far down the road.
Well, I know it's happening right here in Ottawa where I live, as some of the downtown buildings are being converted. That being said, I think I want to put out the cautionary note that we shouldn't assume that this is the new normal, and that you know we should make all these really massive changes based on something that happened or started about 7 months ago. But that being said, I agree that it makes sense to look at reusing current spaces.
And do you have any suggestions, Liam, for home energy use, on how people can reduce their own energy consumption, or good resources that we could look at?
Well, in general, I think, as I mentioned, the big problem is heating and cooling is done centrally. And so in order to warm up one part of the house, you sort of have to turn on the furnace, which is pretty energy consuming. So of course there's the sweater, and but also using space heaters and fans and things like that to just stay comfortable in your nest, your office, and let the other part of the house fluctuate a bit more.
Yeah, what I was wondering from a GHG emissions standpoint, even if energy consumption increases, it seems like it's possible that the load shift could maybe help with emissions, if it helps reduce the evening peak on the duck curve, for example. Have you seen any studies that showed that kind of benefit, not looking at just kilowatt hours, but looking at emissions?
I'm not aware of any studies that have come out, but certainly you're absolutely right. So the big problem with the electrical grid is that it's very emission intensive when there's peaks, right? Because we tend to rely on gas to achieve the peaks. So I think the fact that people are doing laundry during office hours, and I bake a lot of bread right now during office hours, that's a good thing.
Well, and I can add, I don't know about AEP in Columbus, but Excel in Denver has a program which my wife and I participate in, where we agree that we will not do laundry or use the dishwasher between certain hours, between 2 p.m., I want to say, and 6 p.m. And that when we do use those devices, we never use more than one at a time. So that, for example, most people, they'll do a wash and then they'll put that load in the dryer and they'll run the dryer and they'll run another wash at the same time. But if we only use one of those devices at a particular time, and we never use any of them between 2 and 6, we get a special deal on our electricity rate and we get a lower, electricity bill. So that is one way that cities and utility companies can address this. I'm not sure whether AEP is doing something like that, but it certainly could.
Yes, I'd hate to make a recommendation to Ohio to look to just a little far north Michigan, but I think Detroit, Michigan has been forced to, as a city that had large vacancies for several years and started to reimagine their energy infrastructure. They have some really innovative ways that they've tried to change individual behavior, but also how they have rewired or reapproached the use of energy. So highly recommend Dr. Tony Reams. I think he's still at the University of Michigan now. Him and his doctoral students are doing some really innovative work that city is really a model for, we hope that this is not the new normal, Liam, but in the meantime, looking to the cities that have went through such a decline and they're starting to go through this rebirth and revitalization, it could be worth observing some of the practices that they've used. And I'm not saying this because I'm a Wolverine. I know I'm in the enemy territory, but I do think it could be important for people to learn from cities like Detroit on how they could approach this in the future.
Yeah, absolutely. And I know California has a lot of new time of use rates going on with their major utilities. So I think those time of use rates and demand response programs where maybe you allow the utility to control some of your devices like water heaters. Those could help, but I also think they do tend to affect the smart homes, the newer homes, the more expensive homes first. So it's also not necessarily a perfect solution. And Courtney, you've gotten a question of, can you provide access to your references slide? Would you be able to share that after this? And I think also the reference that you just cited from Michigan.
Sure. I think Brooke has all of our slides. I'm totally fine with sharing my slides if Jerry and Lim are as well. And then I can also send an email to Brooke if she wants to send everything out at once. Perfect.
Okay. All right. So I think we just have time for one last question. We have a question from Doug Hooker from the audience. If telecommuting creates a net energy increase, but a net GHG and single occupancy vehicle decrease, then how might a regional planning agency approach managing the policy dilemma between these two positions? Typically, the energy sustainability agenda and the transportation mobility telework agenda frequently reside in two very different portfolios with different funders and regulators.
I think a lot depends on the third item not mentioned here, which is the home access to renewable energy. In Colorado, we have solar gardens. So that like my wife and I own 12 panels on a solar garden several miles from our home. and we get credit on our electric bill for the energy produced there. We also get a quarterly renewable energy, renewable energy credit check. And so we get about 6 to 8% return on our investment, and can actually say that, you know, all of our electricity is supplied renewably. So even if more energy is being used in the home, if the home is being supplied by renewable energy through programs like Solar Garden, then there's an opportunity to offset it. And, you know, Ohio, I believe, has community choice aggregation, which allows governments to pull together and, on behalf of their consumers, purchase renewable energy. We don't have that yet in Colorado, but that's a great tool for government to say, all right, we're going to have more people using electricity at home. Why don't we use community choice aggregation to make sure that a greater percentage of that electricity is renewable? So there still are a lot of tools in the arsenal, even if things shift from, you know, energy usage downtown to energy usage in the home.
Maybe I'll just add something to that, which is, I think, you know, it's easy to talk about greenhouse gas emissions, but there's a lot of consequences beyond emissions or greenhouse gas emissions for vehicles and single occupancy vehicles. You know, congestion, local pollution, especially near, you know, young families and so on. The fact that you're isolated in a vehicle is, I think, a little bit unhealthy, although arguably as unhealthy as being stuck in your house for extended periods right now. But also vehicles are just an inherently inefficient way to move people around. It's a lot of mass to move around, no matter where that energy is coming from. Even if it's 100% electrical, that electricity is coming from somewhere. So I think, you know, I believe we should look beyond greenhouse gas emissions and really rethink the idea that we're moving people around in single occupancy vehicles.
Yeah, it's a hard problem. It's a big problem. And Brooke just mentioned in the chat that Columbus, Ohio does have energy aggregation on the current ballot with local renewable energy development as a goal. So that's interesting. Great. Well, I think we're just about out of time. I want to thank all of you. This has been a really interesting discussion, and Brooke will share the information about the references with all the attendees. So have a great afternoon, and feel free to follow up if you have any other questions.
Thank you so much for having us.
Thank you, Shayna.
Thank you, Brooke.
Thank you all.
Yeah, thank you, Brooke.
See you later.
See you, everyone.